morning, Vietnam.
Come you back, there's a war. You the bill, all the guns. You that build the death plane. You that build all the bombs. You that hide behind the walls. You be hide behind your desk. I just want you to I can see through your man.
And as one whose heart has ached for the past 10 years over the agony of Vietnam, I will halt the senseless bombing of Indochina on inaugural day.
Making a noise in this world. Making a noise in this world.
American politics will never be the same again. George McGovern's clarion call to the American people. And for a short time, too short, the long-awaited honest man, the prairie statesman, was right. But now, during the first few years of the post-American century, the American political landscape is in disarray. The Republic torn apart by morally bankrupt power brokers waging war on each other, as well as the world, while the American people become dangerously disengaged from the political process they own. Benchmarks of political high ground appear to be non-existent, heroes probably extinct. Instead, we have patriot imposters who can sell war like dish detergent and think nothing of minimizing a child's bloody entrails as collateral damage. Fueled by fear, the Republic stumbles forward, forced to accept an inferior product from hucksters hell-bent on keeping the American people sedated and out of the way, allowing for preemptive strikes on foreign soil as well as domestic 401ks. Dig beneath the surface of spin, and it becomes all too clear that the body politic has few bright spots, few, if any, occasions where peace and justice are suggested as instruments of government, rather than the commonplace offering of violence and lies. Like a man and his message buried deep in the ashes of defeat, a defeat historians have placed among the worst of all time, maybe even the mother of all presidential landslides. But the irony in this subjective treatise is clear. The ultimate political defeat of the American century may also be its high watermark. And if so, what does that say about the electoral process, the American government, and more importantly, what does it say about the forces at work on the American people? It's a lesson that might even offer a faint but legitimate guiding light, a light that someday may blind the current ship of fools, the same fools that more than 30 years later continue their stale and debasing attack on George McGovern and his liberal message of fairness and compassion.
You know the truth I can afford to buy groceries, and I can afford to get sick, and believe me, I can afford to die.
There are 25 million Americans over 65. They are mothers and wives. They are people who once belonged to somebody, and now they belong to nobody. Not even the nation their husbands and sons died for.
It's hard to find a person who's run for something that has engendered as much affection as George McGovern has engendered.
I was waiting at the airport for somebody that Galbraith had described to me as the senator from South Dakota, and he would give me a ride. So I was looking around for somebody who looked like a senator and didn't really see anybody. There was this kind of uncertain man with an old bulging briefcase and a too big suit.
As you know, all politicians are bullshitters, and I suppose George has his aspects too, not to mention myself.
And I was surprised because, I don't know, I was a young journalist. I hadn't met that many senators. I expected him to look like a senator. But after we got in the car together and I began to listen to him, I discovered he not only sounded like a senator, he sounded like a great mind of history.
I remember standing on the floor of the convention as McGovern is being nominated and looking over at the Colorado delegation, and there's, young people and black people and all kinds of different folks in that delegation. It really was diverse, and everyone was crying.
But of course, all this talk about him as a softy, and that he didn't have the spine to be president was just preposterous. I mean, the man's an authentic American hero.
He wanted to be there to advance civilization. If McGovern had won in '72, he would have led this nation on a compassionate future.
I like George McGovern because he wasn't a firebrand, even though they tried to take everything he said and turn it into a table-pounding pronouncement. But he wasn't a firebrand. He was calm, he was thoughtful, he was very articulate. How often have we had those things in our entire history?
I mean, after Watergate, I used to drive around. I drove around with a sticker. I insisted and said, "Don't blame me. I voted for McGovern." And that's the way I saw it.
Can you imagine if McGovern had become president? Can you imagine a world without Watergate, without yellow ribbons, without Madison Avenue-induced patriotism? Can you imagine a world that wasn't hungry?
If you took darkness and lit one match, from miles away you can see that little match. And that's what he was able to do, But his light was too bright. That's what it was. His light was too bright because he didn't understand compromise.
McGovern is in this school, is in this tradition. What he did is as important now as it was then, because American history isn't something in the past, it's continuing. So we are a part of it. Tape is rolling on American history.
There is great difficulty, however, in fighting a guerrilla war. You need 10 to 1 or 11 to 1, especially in terrain as difficult as South Vietnam. We don't see the end of the tunnel, but I must say I don't think it's darker than it was a year ago, in some ways lighter.
There is a light at the end of the tunnel. We can soon bring our troops home. Victory is near.
We still seek no wider war.
Once in 1962, I participated in such a prediction myself. But for 20 years, we have been wrong.
I speak out against this war because I am disappointed with America. There can be no great disappointment where there is no great love. With the Vietnam War drilling a hole through Lyndon Johnson's presidency, as well as everyday American life, New York political alchemist Allard Lowenstein roamed the halls of Capitol Hill looking to dump Johnson. He knew that good old Uncle Baines couldn't be beat, but someone had to raise the moral flag against the war, and his first stop was Bobby Kennedy's office. The first-term New York senator understood the rightness of the cause, but knew that throwing his hat in the ring would surely wreck the Democratic Party and possibly his own career. Kennedy suggested South Dakota Senator George McGovern, probably the most ardent critic of the war. In recommending his friend, Bobby said, George is the most decent man in the Senate. As a matter of fact, he's probably the only one.
Nobody dreamed that Johnson would resign and decide not to run again. I thought, since I was up for re-election to the Senate, it would be better to get a senator who didn't have to forfeit his seat in the Senate. So I suggested Gene McCarthy.
Mr. Moyer says that the vice president's had private doubts about the war. Well, I think everyone has had private doubts, but there comes a time when the private doubts of a public man must become public doubts.
Gene McCarthy did not win the New Hampshire primary, but everyone, you know, the final vote was LBJ 49, but McCarthy 41. That was a tremendous showing.
Accordingly, I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
When Johnson withdrew from politics, that did not necessarily clear the way for Eugene McCarthy. What it did was to clear the way for Hubert Humphrey, the establishment center's automatic candidate. That pushed Bobby Kennedy to the decision to enter the fray himself.
I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policies.
You know, there was a kind of a sadness somehow about that last visit of Robert Kennedy to South Dakota. As he said goodbye to me, he seemed to me a lonely, forlorn figure taking on the established power of the country in that race. Of course, I never saw him again.
But George McGovern happens to be the kind of a person of which South Dakota can be proud. Those of us who are colleagues of his in the United States Senate can be proud. And the United States of America can be proud that he's in public life.
Bobby not only scored a big victory in California, he scored a victory in South Dakota. And just before he went on the stage to give his victory speech, he took a call from George, who told him that he not only had taken South Dakota, he had gotten 100% in several precincts, including a couple of districts that were entirely made up of Native Americans, and that meant something to Bobby. George wished him well and went to bed. About 2 o'clock in the morning, he was awakened by a call from his assistant, Jeff Smith, who was in tears.
Be very careful. Get the gun. Get the gun. Get the gun. Take a hold of his thumb and break it if you have to.
Well, I was on the Kennedy funeral train. I was somewhat shocked when people in the Kennedy entourage started to talk to me, not members of the family, but members of the team, about trying to take his place and announcing for president.
But the one thing that he was really concerned about was that the establishment was going to pursue this war. Nobody was going to be there to make a case against the war at the Democratic Convention.
So finally I decided I would do it. I was right in the middle of a campaign for re-election to the Senate, and that I was simply trying to hold the Kennedy delegates and the Kennedy standard at the convention. I've always been glad I did that.
I share with countless other Americans a profound sense that the untimely deaths of John and Robert Kennedy, and as well of Medgar Evers and Martin Luther King, have left a painful void of unfulfilled dreams that all of us must try to restore. It is for these purposes that I declare myself a candidate for the presidential nomination.
I think that some of us probably enraged Eugene McCarthy with buttons that said, McGovern is the real Eugene McCarthy, because he had had the record on the war that McCarthy hadn't.
The Democratic Party has blood on its hands. And because there's a struggle going on in the world today between young people and between those old menopausal men who run this country. And it's a struggle about what the future of this country is about.
And I think that withdrawal would be totally unrealistic and would be a catastrophe.
Chicago, 1968. Definitely not the summer of love, a moment when the better angels of our nature were so unmistakably missing. It was also when the 1972 candidacy of George McGovern began to mount.
I first met him in 1968 at the Chicago Convention, where the police rioted, and we saw American democracy in action. American democracy was then called Mayor Daley.
The issue was Vietnam, and if you were against the war, you got your head cracked. It was that simple.
I remember being outside of the Hilton Hotel in Chicago the night that Hubert Humphrey had won the nomination, and being gassed.
We were seeing a police riot, as Jimmy Breslin later aptly named it. You know, the police were completely out of control.
Well, it was a sickening scene. You saw two groups of young people facing each other, the youngsters who were protesting the war, and then these young policemen. I frankly had a tinge of sympathy for both sides because it was the war that tore that city apart.
I also remember at the Bronx V8, I remember being in one of the rooms, one of the paraplegics, and the TV was on. And I remember the chant, "The whole world is watching, the whole world is watching."
Mayor Daley played it perfectly to get everybody angry at McGovern and the peace campaign.
His authority was being challenged, in his mind, by people who really had no right to challenge it. They had no experience in politics.
And it was ugly as hell. And Dick Daley, incredible control over his police. I mean, these were scenes right out of Nazi Germany in the early 30s, after Hitler took power, cracking down on any dissent.
And I remember saying to myself, almost in a whisper, "That's wrong. That's what they're doing. That's wrong."
And I think that was the first time I really began to get scared about the possibility of the government becoming my enemy.
All the veterans in the room were cheering on the beating of the protesters, but I didn't cheer that night. I remember feeling an empathy for those protesters who were being beaten. So things were changing inside of me.
I was laid on the floor and I laughed so hard. My wife said, "What's wrong?" I said, "The world has changed today. The white folks around the world have never seen their white children get beat up." I mean, white folks had always looked at the cops. This is the guy that comes get my cat out the tree in the suburbs. And he's always there to keep them away from me. Remember one thing. Going into that 68 convention, the chant was support your local police. Coming out of that 68 convention, something happened.
Abe Ribicoff probably enjoys the distinction of uttering the most famous line of the entire convention.
With George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo's tactics in the streets of Chicago. With George McGovern, we wouldn't have a National Guard.
Richard Daley saw this as a personal attack, and in a way it was a personal attack. It was his police force. And of course, he mouthed the famous reply to Abe Ribicoff. There's a lot of debate over what he actually said. And here you might want to run that tape and let people...
What do you think he said?
I can't remember exactly what it was. I don't want to say. I'm sorry. I just.
Okay.
I
That's
can't.
all right.
I
Okay.
can't use those words.
I don't even want you to do.
He calls him a motherfucking son of a. No, he's anti-Semitic in this. He says something like you. He uses the word Jew in this also. You can get. There are better people than me to do that. Really, I think. Yeah. God bless you. Yeah.
How hard it is to accept the truth.
The ugly events that summer sent a clear message to George McGovern and every other Democrat with a heartbeat. Your party is in dire need of repair. In fact, Hubert Humphrey did not win a single primary, and yet he was the party's nominee.
He comes out of the convention with his stature enhanced, and it really is one of the big steps forward for him in becoming a national figure. He ended his last press conference as the convention was coming to an end very, very eloquently with a call to common sense and humanity. And when he finished, he got a standing ovation from the reporters who were covering the conference. That was really quite a remarkable thing.
To my surprise, the National Press Corps that was out there broke into applause. I'd never seen that in a press conference, and I was very moved by it.
How unusual is that? When was the last time you saw it happen?
Nobody ever sit down in front of a military without nothing until they saw black folks and decent white folks sitting down in front of the mightiest nation in the world and said, "Bring on your best shot, baby, we ain't going nowhere." You see, King was not killed because of civil rights. He was killed because he was the first black person in the history of America that got in a position to determine public policy. That had never happened before. Pow, take him out.
Eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
My God, political assassination is now becoming a part of American politics. How could that be? You know, I mean, that's what happens in European countries or Latin American countries. In the United States, political assassination determines the outcome of political feuds.
There'll come a day, 1,000,000 years from now, if there's anyone on this planet, the only reason America will get mentioned because they'll have to say where King was born. Only reason. No other reason.
1968 was arguably one of the worst years in American history. It begins with the Tet Offensive in January. In March, Lyndon Johnson withdraws from politics. In April, Martin Luther King is assassinated in Memphis. In June, Bobby Kennedy is assassinated in Los Angeles. In August, you have the disastrous Democratic Convention in Chicago, and the whole thing is crowned by the election of Richard Nixon as President of the United States in November of '68.
I can't recall any time in my life up to that point when I was so deeply concerned about the well-being of this country. I knew we were on the wrong track.
With the election of Richard Nixon, the year 1968 came to a fitting conclusion. This was the same Dick Nixon who rubbed red-baiting elbows with Joe McCarthy, demolished with glee the political careers of Jerry Voorhees and Helen Gahagan Douglas, who he said was pink right down to her panties.
You read about another bribe, you read about another tax fix, you read about another gangster getting favors from the government. The people are sick and tired of it. They're outraged and they want something done about it, and they're tired of an administration which, instead of cleaning up, is covering up the scandals in Washington at the present time.
But this was the new Nixon, the 1968 model. Perhaps Eugene McCarthy summed up 1968 best when he forecast a possible presidential skirmish between Nixon and Johnson as a choice between obscenity and vulgarity.
Nixon was good for black folk because he scared white folk. When they found out Nixon had a hate list and I was number 5, and the AP called me and says, I don't know if you heard the news, you number 5 on Nixon's hate list. What's your comment? I said, tell him I accept before he changed his mind. What we see going on today went on the drawing board for real white folks 40 years ago.
It doesn't do much good to bomb a rice field or to drop bombs on a primitive agricultural country like Vietnam. We haven't protected our men in the South with the bombing. This is the biggest fraud ever perpetrated on the American people. We haven't saved the lives of American troops in the South by bombing the North.
We might say first that lies are natural to governments. And this is true whether it's a totalitarian government or a democratic government. They lie most about war, because in war, there is the sharpest difference between the interests of the government and the interests of the people, because in war, the people will die.
If I died in Vietnam, I would die serving the country that I loved. And I think that millions of young men who went to that war felt that way. And we believed them. We trusted them. We had faith in what they said we had to do was the right thing. And we went to that war believing in our hearts that we were right and that our government would never lie to us.
They took all your dignity and all your sensitivity and just inexorably grind it out of you, strip it off of you, and they make you into a little zombie.
They used to say, contain China. Well, it's all right, if you want to contain China, why are you hitting the Vietnamese, who have been China's enemy for 1,000 years? But you see, that's history, and the United States of amnesia does not admit that there has ever been history or anything happening before Monday morning's New York Times, which is apt not to be historical.
And when the Vietnam War started, I found myself really feeling estranged, because I thought not only should we not be there, but if we're there, we should be on the other side.
So they couldn't think of a reason. It was containing China. They got tired of that one. And then I realized it was a war of imperial vanity. At least we are thieves in Iraq.
It's really alienating to feel that your country is at war and you think the other side has more merit.
The Lyndon Johnson people were pissant fools, to use his colorful language. They were just fools. How dare anybody stand up to us?
Take the camera out of Vietnam. It's just another war. There's something coming in my house, and these cats don't look like John Wayne. And they hollering and screaming. And you hear folk cussing, man. Get that motherfucking helicopter over here. You never heard this before.
I was a baseball player, so we got the war about 3 years late. I was called the communist. I was known as the communist on the team, on the baseball team.
And then they made the mistake to sit and look at it with their children. Little children looking at Vietnam. Wasn't no saying it's bad guy and good guy. They was looking, seeing people get killed. This was in your living room.
On a baseball team, anybody who, gets caught reading a book or have an opinion on politics was a weirdo. So I was always considered a weirdo.
See, America have always had a nigger with us. And would kick us and we'd say, oh, boss, did I do something wrong? Excuse me, boss. Then he went over there, thought it was a nigger, and he kicked at him, and that Vietnamese grabbed his foot. Now, he never had his foot grabbed before in the history of America. And he ran across some niggers that wasn't scared of him.
He's the universal soldier, and he really is to blame. His orders come from far away no more. They come from here and there, and you and me. And brothers, can't you see? This is not the way we put the end to war.
In January of '69, Nixon and Kissinger told William Fulbright, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, just give us a year to end the war. And of course, the Democrats obliged. What's another year when it's not your kid's blood? American casualties continued, as high as 2,000 a week, with Nixon's bombing campaign intensifying to new levels. Deploring the killing, McGovern hit the Senate floor, calling for an immediate end to the war. Not one United States senator joined him. He was ridiculed on Capitol Hill and scorched by the press. During the '68 campaign, Nixon promised that he would unveil his secret plan to end the war. To this day, Nixon's secret plan has remained a secret.
The greatest honor history can bestow is the title of peacemaker. This honor now beckons America.
There are a lot of Americans who are not offended by the idea that we're at war and killing a lot of natives. There were still a lot of people who thought, yeah, it's a pretty good thing, let's go get those gooks.
There has been and continues to be opposition to the war in Vietnam on the campuses and also in the nation. As far as this kind of activity is concerned, we expect it. However, under no circumstances will I be affected whatever by it.
The President of the United States said nothing you young kids would do would have any effect on him. Well, I suggest to the President of the United States, if he want to know how much effect you youngsters can have on the President, he should make one long-distance phone call to the LBJ Ranch and ask that boy how much effect you can have.
McGovern made a number of trips to Vietnam to see the battlefields firsthand, the jungles that were claiming so many lives. His first trip was in 1965.
I went to a hospital of American soldiers in Saigon. The very first person I talked to was a captain, and the nurse who was taking me around said the captain got the Silver Star and the Purple Heart. I said, well, congratulations, Captain, and as I did so, his lips started to quiver, and I looked down on the bed and his feet were gone. He had stepped on a mine and blown off his feet about 6 inches above the ankles, and I visited with him for a while, and I said, well, congratulations again, Captain, on the Purple Heart this morning. He said, that's easy to get in this damn place. I went into a civilian hospital where the Vietnamese were being cared for. They were the victims of shrapnel from American gunfire. One woman had a baby that she was holding. The baby's head was completely wrapped in bandages except for the eyes. And I asked her if she would mind if I took a picture of her and the baby. She picked up an old rag to wipe some of the blood off the bandages on the baby's face and then tried to smile wanly, and I took that picture, which I still have. Douglas MacArthur told the Senate Armed Services Committee after the bitter experience in Korea, any American commander-in-chief who ever again commits young Americans to warfare on the Asian mainland ought to have his head examined.
By mid-1970, with Nixon in office a year and a half, his secret plan to end the war obviously nothing more than campaign rhetoric, he and Kissinger roll out another fairy tale, Vietnamization.
The idea was to reduce the number of American troops in Vietnam. At the same time, you increase the size of the Army of South Vietnam. The catch there, however, was that in order to even Vietnamize the Vietnam War that way, you still had to sustain the bombing. And under Richard Nixon, it must be said that we dropped yet another equivalent of World War II on Vietnam. And of course, Nixon expanded the war into Cambodia in the spring of 1970.
I thought it was just terrible, the way the Nixon people handled Vietnam. We could have gotten out and saved 25,000 young American lives, probably at least 1 million Vietnamese lives. We killed 2 million people, but most of those people were the casualties of American bombers, tanks, flamethrowers, automatic weapons, chemical warfare, defoliation of the trees, and all that sort of thing. So Nixon was responsible for a great part of that by not ending that war when he came to power. And there's no excuse for that war going on 1 month afterwards. The country was ready for some kind of a settlement at that point. I think that's a tragedy.
Never again will we send the precious young blood of this country to die trying to prop up a corrupt military dictatorship abroad.
I grew up with the Bayonne Times, and I grew up with this little graphic in the corner of that front page, and it was a little silhouette of a soldier and a bayonet on a rifle. And that stood for how many killed in action in Vietnam. And if that didn't scare the hell out of you as you were coming up to draft age, I don't know what did. The fact that they could simplify human death to a little graphic on the front page of a newspaper first scared you and then made you sick.
CO's order was to destroy the village and its inhabitants.
You say, why did you think the
people in the village were Viet Cong?
Some of the people in the village, you say people in the village, some of the people in the village weren't old enough to walk yet.
If we're going to take the canvas of America, then there are stains on the canvas. And here is someone prophetically and courageously first admitting where the stains are rather than lying about them. We have got to confess sins, but then it's never enough to confess sins. That's cheap grace. You have to change the direction. Repentance means changing direction.
George McGovern wanted out. He wanted my friends and my relatives to come home and not in a body bag.
Literally hours before Nixon and Kissinger invade Cambodia, McGovern and Republican Senator Mark Hatfield of Oregon introduced an amendment to the Military Procurement Authorization Bill that, if passed, would prohibit the use of funds to finance American military operations in Southeast Asia after 31 December 1970, the end of the year. The amendment was the first serious attempt by either the House or the Senate to reclaim from the executive branch the war-making and war-funding powers clearly granted to them by the United States Constitution.
The invasion of Cambodia just set the American political landscape on fire. It revitalized the anti-war movement, which had flagged somewhat in the previous months, and it set in motion demonstrations all across the United States on college campuses, and of course culminated in the tragic shootings at Kent State University on May 4th, 1970.
The 4 who died here, the 9 who were wounded here, the many who faced a Portage grand jury, they did more for their country than all the Nixons and the Agnews and the Reagans could possibly do. William Kunstler.
Remember, this is pure tragedy in that sense. The National Guardsmen who were sent to maintain order in Kent State were roughly the same age. In fact, a number of them attended Kent State themselves. I mean, one could have forecast that when Nixon extended the war into Cambodia, this would happen.
To me as a historian, what this tells me is that this is part of an old story. It's really not a surprise that the United States government would turn on its own people. The history of the labor movement is a history of government forces, policemen, sheriff, army, clubbing, killing, disabling people who are out on strike.
That same group had went to Orangeburg, South Carolina, to the University of South Carolina, and killed students. It went to Jackson State in Mississippi and killed students, and nobody gave a damn until it went and did the same thing. And we try to tell white folks what they do to me today, they do to y'all next week. They don't understand that.
I think Hunter Thompson said they looked at the people, they didn't see them as protesters, they saw them as criminals. Well, you deal with criminals in a strong armed way, and if you can work up a good reason to do so, you shoot them. It was awful.
When Kent State hit, we were glad, because now y'all have messed up. Well, that's what we looked at it. The sadness was there, but the outrage that's gonna come out of it is incredible.
It was no longer a political cause to shut down the war, but we felt it was necessary to shut down the whole government, shut down the country until people started to deal with what was happening and how America was being ripped apart.
I sat up more than once consoling the father of one of the girls who was killed. She wasn't in the protest, she was just walking to her next class, and she took a fatal shot, and her father, who was a Pittsburgh steel worker, came to my Senate office and just wept. What kind of a government is this?
I'd rather face machine gun fire before deviate from the teachings of Almighty God and the religion of Islam. I would die.
As the murder rate mounted in the jungles of Indochina, cities and college campuses across America were rife with dissent. Inflation and unemployment had nearly doubled since Nixon came into power. The White House vetoed major health and education bills and then shot down McGovern's recommendation to increase the food stamp program. The Vietnam War was eating the nation and the government alive.
The atmosphere was very tense in Washington. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this country was never more divided over a war, with the exception of the Civil War. Our losses weren't as heavy in Vietnam, but the numbers of people killed by our side was vastly greater. None of those people wanted a quarrel with the United States. And the great tragedy is that we stumbled into that war on the wrong side.
In the summer of 1970, thousands of young people descended on Washington to lobby for the McGovern-Hatfield Amendment. Capitol Hill was inundated by more mail than it had ever received over any issue in American history. It was the thing people were talking about, the amendment to end the war. In September of 1970, the amendment finally came to a vote on the floor. 94 senators were in their seats, and the gallery was filled, overflowing. Eleanor was there, the children were there. It was a highly dramatic moment.
Every senator in this chamber is partly responsible for sending 50,000 young Americans to an early grave. This chamber reeks of blood. Every senator here is partly responsible for the human wreckage at Walter Reed and Bethesda Naval and all across this land. Young boys without legs or arms or genitals or faces or hopes. Don't talk to them about bugging out or national honor or courage. It doesn't take any courage at all for a congressman or a senator or a president to wrap himself in the flag and say, we're staying in Vietnam, because it isn't our blood that is being shed. So before we vote, let us ponder the admonition of Edmund Burke, that great parliamentarian of an earlier day. A conscientious man would be cautious how he dealt in blood.
It's a paraphrase of John Bright, who was the greatest radical orator in all England. He said, I hear in this chamber as we speak the wings of the angel of death.
The vote was taken, and the tally came to 39 for the amendment to end the war and 55 against. Although the vote was a failure, and McGovern was disturbed about that, increasingly he came to the conclusion toward the end of 1970 and into early 1971 that the only way now, it seemed, that you were going to change the war policy was to change the White House.
For a revolution to take place, three things are necessary in a democracy. One, crisis times, a critical period. Two, there must be a manifesto or set of ideas, crystal clear. And three, a great leader.
Quite frankly, I think this is one of the great contributions that George McGovern has made into American politics. Prior to the 1970s, you know, the so-called smoke-filled room dominated politics.
The delegate selection process had really been one of cronyism and a pretty closed process. I do remember, for instance, that we once had to get an injunction to find out where an open caucus was being held. You know, a theoretically open Democratic caucus.
And the party itself, the establishment party, understood after '68 that we could not have a rerun of that in '72. It would blow the party right out of the water.
The concession was made that a commission would be set up to study the rules, to make necessary changes. Very, very important.
And so the reforms that were sanctioned by the party itself that came out of that commission were designed to take the party out from behind the back rooms and put it out in the open.
First of all, it did away with the notion of so-called ex officio delegates. In other words, the old rule was if you were an elected official, you automatically were a delegate. Now, if officials, let's say a congressman or senator, wanted to be a delegate, they got to run for it. Second change, that there shall be no winner-take-all primaries, that there has to be proportionate voting. In the old days, if you got 55% of the vote in the primary, you got 100% of the delegates. And then the third thing, and this was quite controversial, was the quota system that was set up, that there has to be a certain number of males, females, blacks, and people under 30.
It wasn't so much that you had to have a balanced delegation, but if you didn't have a balanced delegation, you had to at least show that you'd made an effort.
Like all consequences, there are the unintended. And what, in effect, this change did was change the nature of the type of person who was a delegate at a convention. Now, instead of a party regular, in the old-fashioned sense of the word, who chose an affiliation with a candidate, the candidates tended to choose what I would call the true believers.
There are those critics since then who have blamed, first of all, blamed George McGovern for the changes as they were perceived to be bad, and second, believed that that period divided or, if not destroyed, the old Democratic Party.
But the fact of the matter is that the McGovern-Fraser Commission regulations transformed presidential politics.
I think it saved the Democratic Party. I think had there not been a McGovern Commission, had there not been party reforms, there would be 2 or 3 Democratic parties today.
More than 2 years before the first primary, and against ridiculous odds Jimmy the Greek set at 500 to 1, George McGovern began his quest to take America home. The experts didn't give the prairie populist a snowball's chance in hell of surviving one primary, if he even got that far. Gary Hart summed up conventional wisdom this way in his chronicle right from the start.
He's a nice man, decent, honest, perhaps even courageous. He says what he thinks, but he can't win. He's from a small Midwestern state. He has no money, no standing in the polls. He doesn't have the backing of organized labor or any substantial element of the Democratic Party. Worse still, he's a one-issue candidate, the war, and that issue will be gone by 72. But above all, he doesn't have charisma.
Well, I think that's a lot of nonsense, this charge that I was too decent and too nice a guy to be president. You can't be too decent to be president of the United States. But I used to tell the press, look, if you want me to give you a list of all my sins, I can come up with a lot longer list than any virtues. The truth of the matter is that we've had too much indecency and too much dishonesty in our national leadership.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
We did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages.
I believe that we will find the truth, and the truth is he was developing a program for weapons of mass destruction.
January 1971, in the middle of a South Dakota winter, 1 year after a skeleton crew headed by Gary Hart and Frank Mankiewicz pieced together a national political organization and strategy, George McGovern announced his candidacy for president.
I now seek the presidency as a public servant.
My mind that day went back 16 years when I first announced for the House of Representatives of the United States. I couldn't help think on the days in the House, the years in the Senate, 2 years at the White House with President Kennedy.
In many respects, the political education of George McGovern exists between the worlds of two Hueys, Huey P. Long and Huey P. Newton. Both men, progressives in their own way, fought the crooked machine, Huey Long in the 1930s in Louisiana, and Huey Newton in the 1960s in Oakland, California. Both men battling for the needs of the many against the forces of the privileged few. For his entire life, George McGovern has embodied the same spirit.
did grow up in the Great Depression, and we were poor. My father, as a minister, frequently got paid with a sack of potatoes or a quarter of beef or a half a dozen chickens, whatever the farm people could bring in. But I never knew we were poor because everybody was poor. There weren't any rich people in the Great Depression. I can remember him sitting at an old Woodstock typewriter, typing out his sermons, which he did word for word. He didn't like the fire and brimstone type of evangelism that some preachers offered. I never had one day of doubting the character, the integrity, the truthfulness of my father. Well, my mother was a gentle woman. She was also a strong woman. She didn't believe in war. Even when I was fighting World War II, she grieved as much about news stories talking about the death of the enemy soldiers as she did about our own. A loss of a life was a loss of a life. She always thought war was a barbaric way for human beings to settle their differences.
Eleanor Stegeberg and George McGovern both attended Dakota Wesleyan University in Mitchell, beginning in the fall of 1940.
I met her on this campus here. You know, we were walking over here towards what was then College Hall. I was swinging my hand, it just touched hers, and it was like electricity. Nothing we could have done would have warmed my spirit any more than that. I knew then I was in love with her. I've been in love with her ever since. The whole student body turned up at the Milwaukee Railroad Depot to say goodbye to Walt Kryman and me. And there was my mother. Everybody else is cheering and clapping and celebrating, and my mother just stood there quietly with a tear coming down her cheek. I suppose in the back of her head she wondered if she'd ever see me again. And it's lucky she did. Half of the people I flew with never came back.
George later trained to become a pilot of a B-24, which was a lumbering four-engine craft. Distinctive architectural look is the vertical tail. Maybe you shouldn't go into that.
No,
you'll have a
good
picture.
Footage of that. I was seeing
okay.
the
But then you don't need a person to describe what it looks like.
Oh, sure I do.
Okay. All right.
I remember one day we taxied out to the runway, and the plane ahead of me took off, raised up maybe 15 or 20 feet above the runway, and then stalled and crashed.
He flew some 35 missions over Austria, Czechoslovakia, Germany, when the average lifespan of a crew was about 15 or 16.
It caught fire, it blew up, there was nothing left. The same people who 15 minutes before I was having breakfast with, talking about the Yankees and the Cardinals and who was going to win the World Series.
He was always calm under fire. He never lost his temper. He didn't shout orders out. One crew member after another would say, if George ever was upset or was rattled on any of those missions, none of us ever knew it.
I've seen airplanes right off my right wing or the left wing on my bomber in formation take a hit over the target, catch fire, explode, no parachutes as it screamed towards the earth.
Of all the men who ran for president of the United States, Republican and Democrats together, none of them had a more impressive military record than George McGovern.
War is one of those enterprises in which the older people bury the young. That puts things upside down in terms of nature. It's the worst thing that men do to each other. I can't think of anything more barbaric than organizing the resources of a great country, putting them into armies and navies and air forces and getting into pitched battles that you know are going to slaughter people on both sides. It's a barbaric practice.
What was Hiroshima like, Jesus, when the bomb fell? What went through the minds of mothers? What happened to the lives of children? What stabbed at the hearts of men when they were caught up in a sea of flames? Save us from ourselves. Spare us the evils of our hearts, good intentions, unbridled and mad.
Now married to Eleanor and a new father, McGovern returns home to finish his degree at Dakota Wesleyan, thanks to the GI Bill. Nightmares of the war jar him awake. The transition back to civilian life was tough, but in time he's able to numb the pain.
When George returns to America, he's imbued with a spirit of excitement and hope about the future of the United States, and his experiences in World War II make him want to become a part of what's going to happen, to have a role somehow in America's bright future.
During the early intrigues of the Cold War, McGovern enrolls at Garrett Theological Seminary in Chicago, thinking he might follow in his father's footsteps. But after 9 months, he decides to follow his own path and pursues his PhD in history at Northwestern University. His political consciousness is being raised as the United States and the Soviet Union embark on post-war insanity.
Without question, this Cold War atmosphere contributed to the development of the what some have called the garrison state, a very strong, permanent military establishment.
And Truman, of course, is the villain. And corporate America wants him as a hero because he really started the Cold War. He kept it going by terrifying the people. The Russians are coming. They've got the bomb. They've got the super bomb. And from then on, the presidents say, terrorism, that's the way. Get a great enemy, it's going to hit you in the night. So our rulers, who are now plutocrats, rule entirely by terror, mostly invoked by them.
The National Security Council came up with a very famous document known as NSC 68, which really became the blueprint for the Cold War, because now NSC 68 argued that American security was truly global. And as a strategic doctrine, it tended to elevate, say, a small, localized communist uprising, let's say, in Indochina, to the same level with Western Europe. And clearly, Vietnam was not remotely the same kind of strategic interest to the United States. Nonetheless, that is the document that you can see Vietnam written between the lines there.
As early as the late 1940s, scholars were warning about the developing revolutions in Asia, the attempt to throw off colonialism, to win their freedom from white Western rule. And they told their readers that we couldn't stop those revolutions. And they mentioned Southeast Asia, where Ho Chi Minh and his guerrilla forces were already on the move against the French. We should have listened to those writers.
McGovern becomes a popular and controversial professor at his alma mater, Dakota Wesleyan. He begins writing and speaking in and around Mitchell. One article suggesting the admission of Red China into the United Nations. And this sets off the local American Legion, as well as a storm of negative letters to the Mitchell paper about what this radical professor is suggesting. He then writes a series of articles about the history of the Democratic Party and how liberalism evolved over the course of American history. The articles catch the eye of South Dakota's Democratic Party, which is virtually comatose at the time. McGovern has a young family, 4 children, a new home, and the guarantee of a tenured teaching position. His life is secure.
It's not a very sensible thing to do, but he decides to resign and become the executive director of the Democratic Party.
He couldn't stand to see the overwhelming superiority of the Republican Party in South Dakota. The work he did, he and his wife Eleanor, were just unbelievable, how they spent days and nights on the road trying to organize people, and he got it done.
When I started that organizational activity in 1953, out of the 110 state legislators, only 2 were Democrats. That was about the ratio that many South Dakotans thought desirable. They wanted a 2-party system, but with the Republicans running the show.
Almost single-handedly, George McGovern resuscitates 2-party politics in South Dakota. Then in 1956, running on the Democratic ticket headed by Adlai Stevenson, there's a shocking result in the 1st Congressional District of South Dakota. 34-year-old challenger George McGovern beats 4-time incumbent Congressman Harold Lovery by 12,000 votes. The win was so unexpected that one major newspaper didn't even mention McGovern by name in its headline, reporting that Representative Lovery was defeated by his opponent.
I felt sure the last 60 days of that campaign I was going to win. That race was probably the most gratifying one I've ever run.
Congressman McGovern's first 2 terms on Capitol Hill were a workmanlike performance, one you would expect from a grizzled veteran. But the issue that set the framework for later battles against U.S. imperialism and his stance against the war in Vietnam was his opposition to the Eisenhower Doctrine.
The State Department persuaded him to ask for a blank check on the right to go to war in the Middle East, even without a declaration of war by Congress. I was a former history and government teacher that learned early that the war declaring power is in the Congress, not the White House.
And McGovern was one of a very small handful of people on either side of the Capitol Dome to vote against that. Hubert Humphrey, his first great political mentor, urged him, don't vote against this.
And so on constitutional principles, I voted against that resolution, the so-called Eisenhower Doctrine. My guess is that Eisenhower himself eventually came to see that as a mistaken request.
In 1960, standing on the edge of the new frontier, George McGovern makes his first run for the United States Senate, and he runs against the senior senator from South Dakota, Carl Mundt, a leftover disciple of Joe McCarthy and a close friend of Richard Nixon. In fact, during the campaign, Mundt is endorsed by that pillar of American justice, J. Edgar Hoover.
It was a little bit like David and Goliath. He started attacking Mundt as an extreme witch hunter, supposedly, before Mundt started attacking him as, pink around the edges, that sort of thing.
So it was easy to start to smear him. I mean, McGovern became a synonym for communist, He's about as communist as my Aunt Lorene in Madison, South Dakota.
Can you imagine if this country elects a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate and elects Dick Nixon, Republican President of the United States, who in 1952 said Adlai Stevenson had a degree from the Cowardly College of Containment, in 1954 called Truman a traitor, in 1960 called me a liar, in 1960 called Lyndon an ignoramus. Lyndon says he called me one. No, I say he called Lyndon one. He called me rash, imprudent, reckless, naive, and uninformed, but he called Lyndon an ignoramus.
He was a very loyal supporter, even though he realized that it wasn't going to help him. He introduced him to the crowd at the National Plowing Contest, and Kennedy didn't do all that well at that particular speech.
He laid an egg. It was not a good speech. Unusual for Jack Kennedy to lay an egg, but he knew he'd laid an egg. He said, what am I going to do when I get to Mitchell? I said, well, Jack, there's 5,000 or 6,000 people there waiting at the Corn Palace. If I were you, I'd throw away that speech manuscript you had here. It's no good anyway. Just walk out on that stage and say, I believe the farmers of South Dakota can do more for peace in the world than any other group of Americans if we remember that food is strength, food is health, food is energy, food is hope. And if I'm elected President of the United States, I suggested he say, I'm going to create a new office in the White House called Food for Peace. And I'm going to put somebody in charge that knows about farmers and that will quit talking about burdensome farm surpluses.
So that's what he did, and it really worked well. It clicked, and he made a terrific impression.
3 days after the election, when he must have been exhausted, he called me, George, this is Jack Kennedy calling. I'm sorry I cost you that race out in South Dakota. I said, look, Jack, you didn't cost me that race. My name was on the ballot. I didn't get enough votes. If I had won, I wouldn't give you credit, so I'm not going to blame you when I lose. Well, he liked that. He says, well, George, that's fine, but Bobby told me what happened out there. I know that I cost you the election. Before you make any plans, come and see me.
His third day in office, Kennedy created a new position of Director of Food for Peace, appointed George to it with the co-curricular title as Special Assistant to the President of the United States. Not bad.
For 2 years, McGovern travels the planet, establishing Food for Peace as well as the overseas school lunch program. He witnesses and touches incredible misery, and in just the first 6 months of his tenure, he ships out 6 times the volume of food that the Eisenhower administration had shipped in 6 years. By the time he leaves his post to run again for the Senate, 35 million hungry children worldwide are sitting at Food for Peace tables on a daily basis. Directing Food for Peace meant a great deal to George McGovern, but he still longed for the rough and tumble of American politics. So in 1962, against John Kennedy's wishes, McGovern runs and wins a narrow victory to the U.S. Senate, and as always, hits the ground running. His first speech regarding America's Castro fixation was bold and set the framework for his soon-to-be reputation as an independent political force.
McGovern did learn that President Kennedy was not all that thrilled about the speech because, in a sense, he was also criticizing the Kennedy administration for failing to plumb the causes of social upheaval in Latin America and by implication elsewhere.
In September of 1963, McGovern delivers another speech on the Senate floor, and this one proves to be one of the earliest and most trenchant cautions regarding the gathering storm in Southeast Asia.
The failure in Vietnam will not remain confined to Vietnam. The trap we have fallen into there will haunt us in every corner of this revolutionary world if we do not properly appraise its lessons and then rely less on armaments and more on the economic, political, and moral sources of our strength.
He said that this unjust war would haunt us in every corner of the revolutionary world. He really was very early and maybe the first, and also very, very outspoken. But also he had, at the same time, had been talking about white racism at a time when everybody else was at most talking about the Negro problem.
But the poor white man's used in the hands of them all like a tool. He's taught in his school from the start by the rule that the laws are with him to protect his white skin, to keep up his heat, so he never thinks straight about the shape that he's in. But it ain't him to blame, he's only a pawn in their game.
Renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
I regret my vote for the Gulf of Tonkin more than any other vote I cast in 22 years in Congress.
In August of 1964, the United States orders surveillance vessels up and down the coast of Vietnam. 2 separate but similar incidents occur in which North Vietnamese torpedo boats allegedly attack 2 American destroyers, the Maddox and the Sea Turner Joy.
And then the captain reported back, hold off just a minute, we're not sure what we were firing at, because it was heavy seas at night, and Johnson later made the remark that for all he knew they were shooting at whales, and he wasn't talking about the country.
And the president goes before Congress and says, I need a resolution authorizing me to use whatever force is necessary in Southeast Asia. How is anybody to know what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin? They take the president's word for it. Now, you would think that senators would be smart enough to know that presidents cannot be taken at their word.
Only 2 senators dissented, Greening and Morse. It's unanimous, virtually, which simply stated that the president can use whatever means necessary to protect American lives in Southeast Asia. Now, I have no doubt that most senators and congressmen did not know that Lyndon Johnson, then president, would interpret this as a declaration of war.
I still had reservations about it. I should have stayed with those reservations and voted no.
Secretary of State Rusk said why would little North Vietnam attack the United States when it knows the United States is just itching for an excuse to make war on North Vietnam? And Dean Rusk replied, "We cannot figure out the ways of the Asian mind."
Johnson once said about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that it was like grandma's nightshirt. It covered everything.
The Democrats trounce Goldwater in the fall, and then in 1965, the best and the brightest intensify the war in Vietnam, unleashing extraordinary American firepower.
We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd.
Johnson remains haunted by his memory of Truman and what happened to him when China fell to the communists. Over and over, he chants to himself in America, "I'm not going to be the president who saw Southeast Asia go the way China went." So fueled by the flawed domino theory, Johnson goes somersaulting into the jungles of Vietnam, or as he liked to call it, that little pissant of a country.
I really thought I would probably be a one-term senator. The polls out in South Dakota showed that the people were overwhelmingly in support of the war. So when I started saying this war is a tragic mistake and we ought to terminate our involvement there, I thought, well, at least I've got 6 years and I'm going to make the most of it.
On Capitol Hill, the war critics were growing. Administration people reported that Johnson would literally get wild at the mere mention of McGovern's name. He scratched off the White House invitation list as persona non grata. And of course, they attack his patriotism, his actions bordering on treason.
Well, this notion that you can't speak out on your convictions during wartime is silly.
That's, of course, the way of the establishment to shut people off. You accuse them of criminal activities, of treason.
It's unpatriotic to lapse into silence in the face of government wrongdoing. I can tell you that I am prouder of my dissent against our long involvement in Vietnam than almost anything else in my public career.
From Huey Long to Huey Newton, the political education of George McGovern, right through the heart of the American century.
But I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
All of those thoughts went through my mind as I was waiting for the television cameraman to tell me to proceed.
I now seek the presidency as a public servant.
So this was a long possibility, what you'd call a long shot.
McGovern said, "Sit down. You've learned something about the delegate selection system. Write out a plan. It shows me how I can win." And that's what I wanted to hear, win.
At first, many thought McGovern was simply carrying the torch for Bobby Kennedy or Gene McCarthy. Bang the idealistic drum a few more times and then step aside for Muskie, Humphrey, or possibly even Ted Kennedy, someone who could actually beat Nixon in the fall.
If that had been the role McGovern had chosen for himself, I wouldn't have worked for him. Any number of other people would not have joined the campaign.
I don't think there was any doubt in my mind, and I don't think anyone else's who put 2 years into this effort, that one, we could win the nomination, and two, that there was a chance to defeat the incumbent president, as difficult as that would be.
At that time, Richard Nixon was really on the ropes in the wake of Cambodia and Kent State. Inflation and unemployment both were edging up towards 6%, which was pretty high back then. Nixon had slammed the brakes on desegregation. He was pursuing his Southern strategy, and of course, he still had this war going on.
Senator Edmund Muskie of Maine became the Democratic frontrunner when the events at Chappaquiddick effectively removed Kennedy of Massachusetts from the race. Muskie was Humphrey's running mate in '68 and had been carefully crafting his leader-of-the-pack image. Muskie had substantial financial backing, a large and very experienced staff, and was clearly considered by the press, pundits, and political pros as the candidate to beat. And he was probably unbeatable at that.
While we wanted support from the Democratic Party organization, we didn't think we'd get it at first.
A candidate running from the outside, as McGovern was, has to energize that base in the party as a Republican, like Reagan would energize the conservative base.
Never at any time did we turn our backs on those people. We just were realistic enough to realize that if we were going to put together a winning organization, we couldn't depend on the established Democratic structure.
And then the trick is that once the nomination is within sight, is to get yourself close enough to the center to ultimately have a viable election strategy.
And a major component of that strategy was to tap into one of George McGovern's strongest attributes, the ability to meet issues head-on. Force the other candidates to take stands, circumvent the media as they attempt to perpetuate the status quo, and then finally, try like hell to put the people in first position.
The first time I spoke against Vietnam, my son was then 9 years old. He's now 19 and faced with the draft. It never occurred to me when I started speaking out against that war that it would someday catch my own son 10 years later.
January 1972, 1 year after McGovern announces the campaign is dead broke. His poll numbers were still at 3%. 30 points behind the man from Maine. Finance Chairman Henry Kimmelman's fundraising was mired in quicksand, and the establishment endorsements were piling up fast for Ed Muskie. Gary Hart called it the Valley Forge of the McGovern campaign. But then a corner is turned, the Iowa caucuses, with ABC News reporting after a strong second-place showing by McGovern, the Muskie bandwagon slid off an icy road in Iowa last night. Once again, the money began to flow.
That was a lifesaver. God bless Iowa. Ed won the Iowa caucuses, but certainly not by the margins that everyone anticipated. And it was the beginning of the end of the notion that the nomination was already decided.
In fact, Muskie was showing signs of cracking before the opening bell even rang. Picketed by a gay liberation group, Muskie exploded at his staff. God damn it, if I've got to be nice to a bunch of sodomites to be elected president, then fuck it.
No other metaphor but that of a guerrilla army on the move can describe the upheaval that was to shake and change the entire Democratic Party in the next 10 weeks. For the march of George McGovern in those 10 weeks would go down as a classic in American political history, a masterpiece of partisan warfare. Its troops living off the land, tapping into frustration everywhere. All of them recruiting, preaching, persuading, stirring to action hearts hitherto unstirred by politics. Theodore White, The Making of the President, 1972.
McGovern gave us a reason to stand up and say, wait a minute, if it's worth believing in, if it's worth doing, I'm gonna do it, no matter what the cost. And McGovern was doing that.
A lot of political amateurs, a lot of people getting into politics for the first time, people feeling like they needed to step in and have a say and start to get involved in the actual gears of how politics worked. We ran a different kind of campaign. We had no money, therefore couldn't buy media, so we had to rely on grassroots volunteers. We knew that from the start, right from the start. And therefore we made appeals on the campuses and to young people and to volunteers. And so you had housewives and ex-baseball players and regular folks who had always watched these things on television. If you were a professional politician, you were almost by definition disqualified.
New Hampshire, the birthplace of the McGovern Army, live free or die. And the Army went to work with a passion rarely seen. And then the candidates started pounding away, town after town, living room after living room. McGovern talked jobs, he talked unfair taxation, wasteful military spending, the big business havens of the Nixon clan, and of course, he talked about ending the bloodshed in Vietnam immediately.
Even if we stayed there and bombed for the next 5 years and Americans continue to die and we spend another $100 billion, 5 years from now we're going to be right where we are now. So let's recognize that we made a mistake And these young men have given their lives, and let's quit killing other young men. Let's bring this war to an end.
In fact, small-town South Dakota politics proved to be a blessing for George McGovern. He clearly understood, even embraced, face-to-face retail politics.
Well, I think it came through all the time. I mean, George McGovern was never a dissimulator. He didn't look for answers that didn't relate to the question. He was a remarkable politician because people sensed at once that he was giving straight, decent, honorable answers.
And the people of New Hampshire responded to the straight, decent, and honorable answers. Muskie won, but not by much. Only 9 points of separation between big money absolute frontrunner Ed Muskie and George, what's-his-name, who rocked endorsement Ed right in his own New England backyard. Not unlike a young Cassius Clay whooping a fat Slow and old Sonny Liston. The campaign was rolling, tapping into new forces, new pockets of strength, as well as some surprising showings in traditional blue-collar Democratic strongholds. The Army was rocking. And then the breakthrough defining moment of the primary run, Wisconsin.
That was a big, big victory. I remember sitting with Pat Cadell, who was our 23-year-old pollster, checking returns, looking at returns from precincts, and somebody, I think it was Lou Harris, came in and said, "Congratulations, guys." He said, "It looks to me like you're going to win this one with about 30% of the vote." And Pat Cadell looked up and he said, it's more like 31.4, Lou. And it was.
After 2 years of backbreaking work and then 2 months of grassroots trench warfare, the Boston Globe announced Senator George McGovern today became the frontrunner in the race for the most delegates to the Democratic Convention this July.
We saw the way clear to a first ballot nomination. People thought I was crazy. But if you look at what was going to happen in Rhode Island, California, and in some of the other states, it was quite possible. And Time put McGovern on its cover and after Wisconsin, and we all began to think, yeah, this guy can win it. We're not just insurgents here. We're likely to take over the country.
The party establishment was reeling because in their minds, the unthinkable was happening. Having Wisconsin in the bag, and with New York and California set up for the taking, the McGovern for President juggernaut, this political shooting star, seemed to have a lock on the nomination. Or did it?
If it had not been for McGovern's phenomenal showing in Wisconsin, I think it might have been financially difficult, if not impossible, to continue the campaign at that point.
A dear man named Henry Kimmelman, who had raised a tremendous amount of money for George, looked at me and he says, well, he said, we may just have the vice presidential nominee of the Democratic Party. And I said, whoa, really? That's really something.
Elements of the party itself were beginning to form against him. And without a lot of, if I may say so, rationality.
I don't think it was still believed by the party establishment that this was going to happen. When the conviction did take hold, what it did produce was Hubert Humphrey's candidacy in the so-called anybody but McGovern movement.
Tuesday night is getting to be the happiest night of the week.
April 25th, McGovern trounces all comers in Massachusetts with a 30-point victory over a fast-fading Ed Muskie. And in Pennsylvania, a state McGovern hardly campaigns in, he finishes a strong second to Humphrey. A day later, Muskie suspends his campaign.
George McGovern, this prairie populist, this so-called radical, seemed to be really closer and closer to the presidential nomination. What was going to become of the party if George McGovern became its leader?
Next was Ohio and a clear-cut confrontation with Hubert Humphrey. But the Ohio primary was marred by charges of fraud and election board incompetence, most of it weighted against McGovern for president. Many wanted the McGovern camp to pursue voting fraud, but the candidate instructed his campaign to move on, knowing that once victorious they would have to mend the fences. Ohio also marked the end of another candidate's campaign, Henry Scoop Jackson, the good senator from Boeing.
Acid, amnesty, and abortion. Acid, you know, that scares the daylights out of people.
First babbled by Hugh Scott and then nurtured nicely by yellow journalists Evans and Novak, the McGovern as radical image was enhanced by the twisted charge, the 3 A's. Desperate and with nothing substantial to run on, Hubert Humphrey and his forces embrace fear as their strategy.
Sheer nonsense and the worst kind of demagoguery, but it did hurt me.
McGovern denounces the mining of Haiphong and other North Vietnamese harbors, as well as the escalated bombing of northern supply routes. He says it's a clear indication of Nixon's failed Vietnamization policy. And then, back in the heartland, McGovern tackles the 3 A's charge head-on, and Nebraska puts him back in the win column. A 7-point victory over Humphrey and his pathetic reliance on acid, amnesty, and abortion. While campaigning in Maryland, Alabama Governor George Wallace is gunned down by Arthur Bremer. There's a very popular school of thought that says any chance George McGovern, or any Democrat for that matter, had of beating Nixon in the fall evaporated that day in May 1972.
Wallace survives, but his wounds leave him a paralyzed man.
Wallace almost elected Hubert Humphrey in 1968. With that configuration, there's no reason McGovern couldn't have won it. I think that was clearly a central event in the campaign, maybe the central event. There are tapes, which I have listened to, in which Nixon tells Chuck Colson to go to this guy, Bremer his name was, to go to his apartment in Milwaukee and plant McGovern literature before the FBI got there. Can you believe a president of the United States telling a staff member to go to this assassin's apartment and plant the literature of his opponent?
You know, I'm not conspiratorial by nature, but look at the events. Wallace was gunned down in May 1972. The break-in of the Democratic Party's headquarters took place in June of 1972. I've always thought, could there be a link?
Bremer was an unemployed dishwasher from Wisconsin. Now, when you check the record, when Wallace was in New York and checked into the Waldorf, Arthur Bremer checked into the Waldorf. Where'd he get the money?
We know that he tracked Wallace. Now, whether it was anything more than that, I don't know.
George Wallace was traveling around on a private jet, and every stop he made, Bremer was there. Okay? Where'd he get the money?
I'm always struck, and I kind of get whimsical about it. Could this have also been a part of the nuttiness we call Watergate?
Now, the weird part is Arthur Bremer had a gun that shoots 5 times. Wallace was hit 5 times. And nobody asked, if I got a gun that shoots 5 times, and Wallace was hit 5 times, who shot the Alabama state trooper, the Secret Service agent, and the woman?
The so-called experts of conventional wisdom said that the young street fighters in the McGovern army couldn't organize California. In fact, they said nobody could. But as Gary Hart recalls, we marched into Lotus Land with the prairie statesmen at the front of a ragtag army of guerrilla warriors.
In a way, this was as good as it was going to get, because the tide was with us. It was a triumph of the best of American politics in a way, that a dark horse, unknown, could begin to lead one of the 2 major parties and possibly challenge the power structure.
Borrowed from the poetry of Jack Kerouac and traveling with the ghost of Robert Kennedy, McGovern embarks on a classic whistle-stop train trek through the San Joaquin Valley, the same trip Kennedy made in '68.
McGovern wasn't campaigning against anyone. He was campaigning for something, for America's heart and soul. He was seeking to lead America home again. The only opponent was Richard Nixon, and who could gainsay the rightness of that cause? This was the people's train, and the people's valley, and the people's state, and soon it would be the people's country. Gary Hart, right from the start.
Unfortunately, California is where things started going a bit awry for McGovern, even though he won that primary reasonably handily. By that point, his only significant challenger was his old dear friend and original political mentor, Hubert Horatio Humphrey.
I don't know what happened to Hubert. He wanted to win the presidency so badly that he decided to sell out his principles.
This was going to be the last time Humphrey had a chance for the big prize, and he took off the gloves. There were 3 televised debates.
He knew that I was going to win it unless he did something very desperate. And he really came after me, hammer and tong. And the Nixon people threw a lot of those same charges back at me a couple of months later.
I know he was shocked. I sat in the television studio in the first debate where Hubert swept the Army and Navy off the table and said, this is what George McGovern would do to U.S. defenses. And you could almost visibly see George McGovern's jaw drop. I know mine did. And it was shameful. I mean, it was a shameful performance because Hubert didn't believe it.
But it was pretty tough there in California. The big attempt to mobilize the Jewish voters against McGovern because he was for fair play in the Middle East. And just generally a very rough campaign.
I can't believe we've won the whole thing.
McGovern wins the California primary, and for all intents and purposes, the nomination. The impossible dream was his. Time to close ranks and take on the darkness that resided at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But the old guard, the Humphrey-Meany-Daley axis, weren't quite done. They couldn't do it at the ballot box. They couldn't even succeed with a greasy last-minute hatchet job. Now they wanted to change the rules.
The attempt to change the rules on California was one of the 2 devastating setbacks to the campaign.
That was a great energy diverter because, as you know, Humphrey came up with this idea that they should get a proportional share of the delegates in California.
And Walter Cronkite interviewed Hubert Humphrey, and he said, Senator Humphrey, how do you expect to head off George McGovern with all these primaries he's already won? Hubert says, well, California is the big one because the winner there gets every vote. And that's where we're going to make our big push. So he understood what the rules were. But once he lost California to me and it became clear I was the one that was going to get all the California delegates, Hubert went into action.
And now the Humphrey people wanted to change it after the result. Unfortunately, they had some allies on the Credentials Committee.
Loss of the California delegation would have meant loss of the nomination.
So we fought hard to uphold the rules. We forgot a lot of other stuff. Nobody spent any time looking for vice presidential candidates.
We were consumed for the next 5 or 6 weeks in beating back that challenge.
Unbelievable. I couldn't believe it. I was stunned by it. Willie Brown led the fight on the floor for us. He closed his speech by saying, "Give me back my delegation," just a shout. And that kind of galvanized the convention. Give me back my delegation.
And the weeks ahead will find the Democrats trying to establish a link between the Watergate and the White House.
Richard Nixon was clearly a desperately insecure man with deep problems.
Burglarizing the Democratic committee headquarters. There's nothing there, for Christ's sake. You know, that's not where you find the key information.
You know, I thought it was a serious matter. I was amazed how lightly it fell on the media and on the press, on the American public. It was almost as though, well, this is politics as usual. I didn't think that.
They weren't really trying to dig up stuff on McGovern. I mean, his public record was enough for them.
Well, when I first heard the reports, I thought George was right. I mean, you know, because he'd been saying this in his campaign. The profound corruption of the Nixon administration was already crystal clear.
The President of the United States surely could not have been involved in this kind of criminal behavior. Surely he couldn't have been that stupid, for one thing, not to mention corrupt.
Very hard to make Americans believe that the President of the United States is at the center of a criminal conspiracy. Now, that was the fact.
I thought it would be a bombshell. The press should have pounced on that with all fours. They knew something about Nixon's background. They knew something about the kind of campaigns he had run in the past. They weren't very straightforward. All during the campaign, I kept bringing it up again, and I think every time I did that, I lost votes.
Because darkness see darkness. You know, if you've been in the dark for so long, light hurts your eyes. Huh? That's normal. I mean, do you remember Dracula? Didn't he have to get back before the sun came out? Okay? And so people are the same way. People get comfortable with filth.
I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
The Democrats put on a bizarre fashion show. If there had been credits for the Democratic Convention, they would have read leading man George McGovern, stage manager Larry O'Brien, fashions by Levi Strauss. The new young Democrats wore their T-shirts and blue jeans and afros and dashikis as badges.
The challenge to McGovern's winner-take-all California victory was a knockdown, drag-out fight. A fight the McGovern Brain Trust would eventually win, but a fight that left a great deal of damage in its wake. But for the moment, a bright and shining moment, the 1972 Democratic Convention was George McGovern's, a convention that looked like no other in American history. A convention that represented the joy of participatory democracy in the hands of average people, a victory over smoke-filled rooms populated by professional greed. For once in American politics, sunshine and light beat shadows and fog.
But the President of the United States can make a difference. He can set the moral and political tone of this country. He can speak out against injustice. He can use the power and the influence of that office to lead us in a more constructive and humane direction.
4 votes for Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm. For Governor George Wallace, 6 votes. 86.5 for Jackson. 119 votes.
Senator George McGovern, having received a majority vote of this convention's certified delegates, is hereby declared the 1972 Democratic nominee for President of the United States.
From secrecy and deception in high places, come home, America.
This was the most open political convention in American political history.
I've been to a lot of Democratic conventions in my time, and I've witnessed Republican ones from afar. It was the only time I've ever seen a convention that actually looked something like the country.
And it seemed to indicate a new dawn, that now politics was not only the preserve of older white men.
Probably the last unscripted convention in American political history. I don't think anybody wanted to take a chance again that something so organic and natural and spontaneous.
Many of the opponents called it the convention of hippies, yippies, dippies, and Jane Fonda. You see?
We really felt that some decisions were actually going to be made down there, not in advance.
This joining together of so many causes, if you will, and all of it in the Democratic Party's platform was incredible. We had planks in that platform, never seen before. Gay rights, for example, broad-based, real civil rights enforcement, abortion, a strong platform for women's rights. These things weren't heard of prior to 1972.
This was democracy in action. This was, I think, for me, the peak of the campaign was seeing that kind of emotion pouring out of people on the floor because they felt that McGovern was going to treat them fairly and do his best, which is not something we've come to expect from politicians.
Well, that's the highlight of my life, I guess, winning the Democratic nomination of the oldest political party in American history. I remember the hands reaching up, the eager, excited faces, people laughing and talking, some weeping. There was a lot of emotion and passion in that campaign, and I'll take those memories with me the rest of my life.
One had to be partial to a man whose delegates had the fair and average and open faces of an army of citizenry, as opposed to an army of Pauls. And Aquarius knew then why the convention was obliged to be boring. There was insufficient evil in the room. Norman Mailer, St. George and the Godfather.
I think because of the great exuberance, there was a lot of ineptitude.
Because there was a real democracy going on, it caused the convention to miss primetime television.
I mean, McGovern's speech, for example, didn't go on until back east till about, what, 2:30 in the morning, 3 in the morning?
When it was prime time in Guam.
It was kind of ridiculous to give the speech at 2:30 in the morning.
I was so exhausted I fell asleep before he came on. But it was a bad deal.
It's one thing for the amateurs to win. It's quite another thing to be effective.
It's definitely his greatest speech of all time.
Well, I don't know, because I didn't see it. How would I know?
It was not a well-planned convention, the '72 convention. It brings the term ad hoc to new heights. But
as shrewd as we were about a lot of the practical politics of the nomination, we were not very shrewd about power. It never occurred to any of us at midnight that night that we now were the party, and that we could have said, no, he's speaking tomorrow.
They certainly weren't going to ask the party pros how to do it. No, we're here because you shut us out before.
From military spending so wasteful that it weakens our nation, come home, America.
It was a very good speech because George was there with the substance. He was there with the content.
From the entrenchment of special privilege and tax favoritism, from the waste of idle hands to the joy of useful labor.
And probably the most beautifully delivered speech of McGovern's entire career. He looked powerful, he sounded powerful.
From the prejudice based on race and sex, from the loneliness of the aging poor and the despair of the neglected sick, come home, America.
His magnificent speech at the Democratic National Convention, I think, would have gone a long way in putting him in a viable position for the general election, except nobody saw it.
Come home to the affirmation that we have a dream. In 1968, many Americans thought they were voting to bring our sons home from Vietnam in peace. And since then, 20,000 of our sons have come home in coffins. I have no secret plan for peace. I have a public plan. And as one whose heart has ached for the past 10 years over the agony of Vietnam, I will halt the senseless bombing of Indochina on inaugural day.
I said in my own handwritten lines, this country has made too many decisions in recent years behind closed doors. And it was those decisions that took us into Vietnam under the leadership of both parties. If I should become president of this country, I want those doors opened and I want that war closed. That line gave me a lot of satisfaction.
Come home to the belief that we can seek a newer world.
Come home to the belief that we can seek a newer world. And we will, Robert Kennedy and George McGovern, we will seek that newer world. We will never allow what happened to my generation to ever happen again. We will never forget the words on that late night in Miami of 1972. Those were precious words. Those were important words.
Three occasions in my life, I have voluntarily gone into hospital as a result of nervous exhaustion and fatigue.
I think the Eagleton affair set those of us who were for McGovern way back.
Well, it seemed like it was obviously a bad choice.
I had this vision of people that I had met during the campaign who were literally just in their eyes and with their hands and their body movements indicated their total trust in my judgment.
The problem with the McGovern campaign was it had to be perfect in absolutely every respect. It was sort of the first bad move George McGovern made.
And now, for the first time, that trust was being shaken by the way we handled this vice presidential matter.
The problem with Eagleton was not so much that he'd had mental health problems and, but that he didn't disclose them.
I'll tell you frankly, I thought school was out. And then, of course, it got worse every day.
Let me say first that too little thought was given to the ultimate choice because of the distraction of the California challenge.
Which gave us less than 48 hours to pick a vice presidential candidate.
So everybody had ideas, and I thought a pretty good idea was Senator Eagleton. He was Catholic from a border state, very well liked by labor, which was always a problem with McGovern because George Meany was a war hawk.
McGovern called him before he actually even got the words out completely. Eagleton said, "Before you say anything more, George, I accept." Eleanor McGovern saw something in him that bothered her. She was really taken aback because Tom was so excited to the point that she wondered that there was something wrong with him because it seemed to be a little bit over the top, almost to the point of maybe being a little bit manic. And Frank Mankiewicz questioned Tom Eagleton in more detail on the telephone. One of the things he said to Eagleton was, "Tom, is there anything in your medical file that the committee to re-elect the president would like to know? Because I guarantee you they have it."
I talked to maybe 20 psychiatrists once we knew the diagnosis, and they all said, without exception, this man can handle easily any job that he is given except President of the United States.
It comes out that Tom Eagleton had suffered from manic depression, had undergone at least 2 series of electroshock treatments. Then Mankiewicz asks Tom Eagleton, "Tom, if you had wanted to leave the hospital, could you have done so?" And the answer was no.
And that's when all hell broke loose,
There was enormous pressure from the new party establishment, that is our own campaign, to replace Eagleton with someone else.
I finally called Dr. Menninger, perhaps the most famous psychiatrist in the country. He said, the trouble with that is that half the American people are scared to death of mental illness, and I don't think they'll support your ticket. On the other hand, another half of the American people have somebody in their family who's been mentally ill or who's suffered from depression, and they'll never forgive you. I said, well, Dr. Menninger, I guess you're telling me I'm damned if I do and damned if I don't. He said, that's the way I see it. That was the saddest statement of the campaign for me.
George McGovern had worked for more than 2 years for the presidential nomination. Tom Eagleton owed it to McGovern to be completely open about his medical record, that this was a potential political disaster.
Constantly coming up with a candidate, turning down, no, I don't want it, Humphrey didn't want it, et cetera, et cetera. So, oh my God, who wants to run with this guy? So he gets a kind of a watered down Kennedy, Sergeant Shriver. Plus the way he handled it, I'm 1,000% behind Eagleton. About 2 days before he dumps him or something like that.
The phenomenon known as the McGovern juggernaut, the People's Campaign, that bright light that was guiding America home, staggered, wounded into the shadows. When they arrived in California just a few weeks before, they were on a miraculous upward trajectory, just a few points behind Nixon. Their motto could easily have been, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. But our second Ali reference only helps to illustrate the plain truth. McGovern's heaven, almost overnight, had turned to hell. And now replacing Eagleton with Sergeant Shriver was like putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound. And then, under the heading of "If I only knew then what I know now," McGovern's high command expressed their innermost frustrations.
Oh, those Democrats. They saw themselves as the real people, dressed for work. The Republicans, of course, saw them as a rabble, dressed for trouble.
More than ever, Nixon now. Listen, America, Nixon now.
The Republicans didn't spend their time milling around in hotel lobbies arguing about women's rights and having black caucuses, I'll tell you that. Many of them spent their afternoons on yachts.
It is my great honor to nominate Richard Nixon for re-election as the next President of the United States.
I express the appreciation of all of the delegates and of all America for letting us see young America at its best at our convention. Let us pledge ourselves to win an even greater victory this November in 1972.
It was as if George McGovern didn't exist. I mean, talk about cutting off the head of the ticket. I saw very few McGovern signs. I think the only McGovern sign I saw was the one on my lawn.
There were a lot of people who were threatened by George McGovern. You had the rise of the neoconservative movement. These were the Democrats who supported the war and were Cold War liberals, and they wanted him stopped. And they were also horrified by the kind of social movements that students were involved in. And here was McGovern reaching out to dissident social movements.
We were easily deceived by expert propagandists, which is what happened in '72. Republicans are very good at getting people to vote against their own interest. Why would anybody with an income of $25,000 a year vote Republican? I just have no idea. And George McGovern had that same problem.
You know, I was brought up in the ruling class. They hate the people. The Bush family, if you gave them sodium pentothal and asked them, "And what do you think about the American people?" you'll hear such profanity as I never heard before. The American people are an obstacle. The Constitution stuck us with all these elections.
I think we threatened the leadership of the Democratic Party in a very visceral way, and I think that they felt that stopping McGovern actually might be best for the Democratic Party.
They were in fear of their political lives, and they were in fear of what might happen if McGovern won.
If he was defeated, maybe the reforms that he brought about would be defeated also.
The only way I made sense of this after the fact was that it was a struggle for power. Not much to do with the issues, but a lot to do with who was going to run the Democratic Party.
Sometimes the losing faction says, gives you the bird and says, good, try and win without us.
You had a whole range of movements that had really shaken the foundation of the United States. You had the civil rights movement, and from that came the anti-war movement. You had the women's movement. You had the gay and lesbian rights movement. And all of these movements were making demands on America and asking for a new kind of rearrangement for power and privilege and a fairness and a seat at the table. But some people were completely horrified, especially by the lifestyle issues. And I mean, it was bad enough that women wanted to be on top. They wanted to be on top of each other. Clearly, America was falling apart.
It's a wonder anybody voted for him.
The major Democratic interest groups, particularly labor, very early. Let the McGovern people know. You don't have us this time.
George Meany never liked George McGovern.
And that's odd because McGovern had one of the best labor voting records in the Senate, had always had.
Well, George Meany by then had become a cranky old man. He'd probably been in that top office of the AFL-CIO too long. He was bitter about my position on the war.
It came out later that Walter Sheridan, who was a big power player inside the Democratic Party, had evidence of Nixon cutting a deal with the Teamsters to let Hoffa out of jail if the Teamsters endorsed Nixon. He never provided this information to the McGovern campaign, which would have been powerful to use in the campaign.
General elections generally go to the man who can betray his hatred of black people in the most tactful way so he can't be caught. And they were masters.
Nixon's interpretation of the Southern strategy was blatantly racist.
Basically, Roosevelt had put together a coalition of the South still dreaming of slavery's return.
And that section of the country that had traditionally been the solid South, solidly for the Democrats, could be moving into the Republican Party to forge a new Republican majority.
How do you take positions that would appeal to the South without becoming so Wallaceite to lose Northern support? And you could see his opposition to school busing, for example, which was a code word.
It was done in a kind of a coded way. It really played on the fears of average white Americans that there was a conspiracy for blacks to storm out of the cities and students to storm out of the campuses, and Jews, who obviously controlled all the banks and the media and everything else, to take over America and strangle it and hand it over to communism through the good graces of President George McGovern.
Early in 1972, Nixon was beginning to crawl out of his political quagmire, one that had gripped his presidency since the invasion of Cambodia. His initiatives with the People's Republic of China, coupled with his historic trip to Peking in February of '72, appeared to be toning down the harshness of the Cold War. Richard Nixon, the man who spent a lifetime protecting Christendom from the Red Menace, had turned the boogeymen into friends, allies, and political cachet.
We believe that peace is at hand.
I had been warned by a number of people during the campaign not to talk about Vietnam too much for this reason. They said, Nixon's very clever. He's going to wind up that war the day before the election. Well, I said they wouldn't dare do something like that. They're not going to keep killing people for 4 years and then end the war the day before. Nobody's going to buy that. But they did. When Kissinger came out a few days before the election, said, now, after all these years, peace is at hand, it was an outrage, in my opinion, and it helped make certain of the Nixon landslide. Nixon the peacemaker.
If he wanted to win, he had two choices. Stay the course, the most reformist candidate, I would argue, in the 20th century, or try to reach out to those groups. What's the cost of that? Alienating his new base, who had been so successful in securing the nomination for him. That's a difficult position to be in.
Massachusetts has gone for the Democratic candidate, the only state going for McGovern.
We project that President Nixon will come out of this the winner with about 60% of the popular vote and somewhere between 450 and 500 or more electoral votes.
Congratulations on your victory. I hope that in the next 4 years, you will lead us to a time of peace abroad.
Hunter Thompson came to my office after the election. He says, I have one question to ask you before I finish this book. Did the American people know you? Did they know Nixon as you two really were and decide that they wanted Nixon? If they really knew him and really knew you and made that judgment, to hell with this book. I don't think it's even worth publishing. But if they didn't know you as you really were and didn't know Nixon as he really was, then there's some hope for the future.
We are not content with things as they are. We reject the view of those who say, America, love it or leave it.
If there is no piper, there is no clarion call.
My most cherished memory of the campaign was the fact that it was a positive campaign. It was a campaign about George McGovern and what George McGovern stood for.
I think the very fact of McGovern in political life and the kinds of issues he was espousing showed people that politics was an arena for the honorable, the idealistic, the just. It wasn't just about money and graft.
Don't do it the way he did it. You're going to lose. I always felt, no, wait a minute. Don't do it the way he did it. Why not? He was honest with the American people. He put forth ideas whose time, certainly one could argue, was, if not now, then it should be pretty soon. And he lost. So what? The ideas are out there.
People who make change often don't win.
How do you call McGovern a loser when he saved hundreds of thousands of lives in Southeast Asia, and not just American, but Vietnamese?
It was a changing experience. It was kind of political Peace Corps.
I really don't know. The answer is blowing in the wind, because what hurts me is that I see that his name is invoked as a symbol of failure more than as a symbol of prescience and principle.
He was the right man at the right time and would have been the right president.
But I do know that when the old McGovernites gather, we gather with a pride that the old Nixonites don't have.
We just lost an election. None of us went to jail. Most of the other guys went to jail. The time, hard time.
Thanks for making our last campaign the very best one of all. Thank you. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
If you look at the story of Jesus Christ, the one thing that keeps coming up was the word no. No. I mean, they say, look, man, we don't want to kill you. The big man came in and said, man, these Jews are crazy, man. We don't want to kill you. But just say that you're not the son of the Father. He said no. He didn't get into no high-fiving or rapping. He just said no. I said, well, let me see this. What did you do? No. Okay, no got him killed.
We didn't take the ball and run with it. McGovern had the ball. He didn't drop it. I think he threw it up there, tried to pass it along, and the class of '72 fumbled.
Compromise wasn't even in his psyche. And because of that, as filthy as America is today, it's a better place. Because of that light. See, once the light hits, you can't turn it off.
But his strength is that he appeals to the hope in us. I suppose that's his strength and his weakness at the same time, because hope is a very unruly emotion.
One day when the real people have to write history, Nixon and them thugs to get a little footnote.
He posits a possibility and leads us toward it. Without an idea, without imagination of change, you can't have change. It's the imagination that comes first.
His contribution is enormous in a prophetic conscience, also pragmatic political way. In other words, we need far more McGoverns. We haven't had them.
I can only imagine what this country might have evolved into if McGovern had won that election. We probably would not be sitting here on a hot August afternoon talking about the what ifs.
As I walk through this wicked world, searching for light in the darkness of insanity, I ask myself, is all hope lost? Is there only pain and hatred and misery? And each time I feel like this inside, there's one thing I want to know. What's so funny about peace, love, and understanding? Oh, what's so funny about peace, love, and understanding? And as I walk on through troubled times, my spirit gets